All right, so hello and welcome everyone on behalf of the GSA's Career Development Subcommittee. I welcome all of you in today's workshop. I want to share a few ground rules and notes with everyone in attendance today. Please note that all the views and opinions shared in this workshop are those of the panelists and not the organization that they represent or have worked for. In addition, any mention of a company by the panelist is not an endorsement of that given company or the brand. And to ensure that the workshop is a welcoming environment for everyone, we want to briefly go over a few code of conduct. Today's event is being recorded, so just a reminder for the Zoom meeting that please keep all your cameras and the microphones turned off at all times. Failure to do so might result in the non-participation in this event. We already have collected questions from all of you for our panelists today. However, if you would like, we welcome you to ask questions to our panelists by dropping them in the chat box. However, if you are disrespectful in the space, we will ask you to leave the workshop. And you also do not need to write down any notes or any resources. This workshop, as it is being recorded, this will be uploaded to the GSA's Career Dev Subcommittee Workshop YouTube channel. You can visit the workshop recording at any time in the future. Today's discussion has been organized by the GSA's Career Development Subcommittee. I'm hosting this event today. However, every member of the committee who has been showcased here has been instrumental in making this event happen. Also, special thanks to Jessica, who's the acting director of the engagement and the early career programs of the GSA Early Career Subcommittee, and Pauline, who is the engagement professional development program coordinator as well. Before we begin the discussion, I would like to share information about today's attendees. Today's audience consists of regular GSA members and the non-members, staff and attendees from industry and academia. We have professors, postdocs, grad students, undergraduate students, project managers, business development officers, and many more. Our audience today is also very international, as you can see, and comes from at least 17 different countries. So let's begin our workshop today and discussion by allowing our panelists to introduce herself by telling us her current position and a brief summary of what her current position entails. So Adriana.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. And thank you, Abby, for inviting me to speak. I'm looking forward to the discussion here today. So my name is Adriana Bankston. I've been in science policy for about the last 7 years or so, maybe a bit more. I transitioned into policy through a advocacy fellowship. I'll talk about that. Worked for several years in advocating for research and science issues, funding and training with Congress, and currently doing some policy consulting with a number of organizations that want to involve their scientists, members, and collaborators in policy. And so I have built a good network in DC, been in the DC area for the last 5 years, and about to transition again into going into a congressional fellowship in September. So I've been sort of working with Congress for the last few years, and looking forward to being in the government pretty soon, but happy to elaborate on any of those steps along the way.
Yeah, thank you, Adriana. So along with those lines, I wanted to ask a question. What areas of your current position were appealing to you, and how did you prepare yourself for this role? And did you have any mentors along the way who helped you get through this position?
Sure. So I have sort of a unique role currently because I run my own consulting firm for the last year. Consulting itself is a long-term career for those interested. For me, it was a good sort of transition year to figure out next steps, and have gained also a good network from this. But I think being a consultant, in some ways, it's a lot like being in academia. You're running your own projects, looking for funding for those things, working with different organizations. So that's one of the things that's been exciting about it. I've been able to work with a number of universities, one society, one think tank, more projects along the way until the end of this summer or so. But so I think that being in academia actually was helpful for being able to manage all these projects and working with the different constituents. Good mentors, I think. I've had a lot of good mentors in policy, and we can talk more about this. People that were, in academia that encouraged me to follow my interest in policy and help me leverage my PhD work towards a policy career. I've also had peer mentors, which I would recommend folks that have been, sort of at the same stage and have gone through similar transitions. And I was able to call them when I had questions or things I wanted to discuss or had roadblocks along the way. And then also mentors who are in policy, who are more advanced, that sort of helped me jump into different opportunities. So mentoring's been a big part of my journey up to now.
Great, thank you. And on the same note, I would like you to briefly touch upon how is this position different from like a lot of academic positions that we think of, especially in the terms of the early career scientists who would like to go into academia. They don't have exposure to a lot of these kind of spaces. So how did you choose, what were the key drivers, and how is this position different from the, say, an academic position?
Yeah, for me, the drivers were really wanting to be creative and understand more about the policy ecosystem. As I said, I've been working with different types of groups, and that's really, it helps you understand where they all plug into sort of the policy ecosystem. I think for me, again, I had been in advocacy for the last few years and wanted to sort of take a break and figure out next steps. So it's been a good sort of gap here in some ways, although definitely not boring. I think when you're looking for where you want to be, it's a good thing to try out and grow your network that way. I think compared to academia, it's very diverse in that, the way I, obviously was in the lab for many years, and you're really used to working on a specific project and direction. And, I worked on muscular dystrophy research, was very sort of well-versed in that space. And then, being a consultant in policy, you work on a lot of different types of issues depending on what your clients are interested in. Basically, most of them have been around science issues, but different sides of that. They have different ways of approaching those questions, and it helps you to think more broadly about questions that impact research from the perspective of that particular organization, what they care about, how they fit into the ecosystem. And it's a lot more, definitely more broad in terms of topics, but also, like I said, it's a lot of creativity to really, they hire you for your expertise, and then you get to sort of drive those different projects for the clients.
Thank you. I guess that's really helpful for a lot of us who are just venturing into that space. Most of us are in the lab doing experiments, but not so much exposed to this kind of work. Along the same line, I would like to ask you, from your experience, basically, what role do the science policy experts would play in a federal government, in a federal system? For example, if the roles change depending on whether you are in a federal government or in a local government or state government, and how does this whole system operates? If you could briefly expand on that as well.
Yes, that's a big question. So I think, when we think about scientists in the federal government, there's actually still a few scientists who are in office at the state or federal level. So definitely there's a push for including more scientists in evidence-based policy in the government. Most of my work has been with the legislative branch, so I can speak to someone did research on this, that there's actually very few scientists who are in office. So more of that, and a lot of these programs encourage that. I think it's not that different. Well, in some ways, obviously, when you're at the federal level, you're working on national issues. If you work for a specific member, though, they're really interested, obviously, in state, what's going on in their state, and serving constituents from that state and meeting with those stakeholders. I think it'll be interesting for me, having been on the other side of, advocating for science from different organizations, university or societies. All these different groups interact with the government, right? And sort of push for change and things they want to see and advocacy or advocate for different issues. And I think that, so if you're in, I think at the federal level, I think it also depends if you're in a committee versus personal office, but largely, right? So the offices will look to serve their constituents, but also obviously interested in broad national issues, especially if they're on the science committee, for example, or specific committees that address large issues nationwide. And then, of course, if you're in state or local government, you might be even more steeped into the specific issues in your state, right? If you're in the city council, there are a number of positions at the state level that do similar things at different scales. In terms of the branches of government, I think, again, I have really worked closely with the legislative branch. I think the legislative branch obviously is where laws are made that sort of trickle down to the executive branch. I know less about the judicial branch, but they interact and kind of go back and forth on issues. But for example, a lot of legislation will mandate federal agencies to create certain programs, right? Either fund the same program again or create new programs, or, there's been a lot of changes in science with, the NSF, TIP Directorate, science changing from, or additionally to basic research, including translational research, and new programs created to support different institutions and diverse scientists, right? Increasing diversity and funding and where the federal money goes. So I think that in a lot of ways, the legislative branch is where it starts, right? Top down, and then agencies are sort of where the action is and the execution of these laws. And again, all these different constituencies, universities, societies, think tanks, all these interact with the government in different ways. And I think the other side is the government is looking for scientific expertise, so all of you guys here from universities can help talk about what's going on in your communities, but also can lend scientific expertise to the government.
Great, thank you. That's a great exposure to the system. Most of us did not know at all about that system, how the system works, and how structured it is. So now that you've been in the system for a while, you've worked as a researcher, also as a policy consultant, and now going to the Congress. So I would like to ask you that what are some of the necessary skills or the trainings that are required for, say, working as an advocate with Congress or going to the Congress, both in the context of the early career researcher or someone who's more established, say, as a professor or as a project manager or in higher up industry, who will be willing to do these kind of roles. So yeah, if you could please elaborate on that as well.
Yeah, so the skills, having had different roles in policy, I can say that it's a lot of writing. So that's something I would encourage you to learn how to write non-academic papers, summaries, blogs, op-eds, memos, all these kinds of things. And there's a number of blogs that I wrote for when I was starting out. Trying to summarize your issues in, 300 words. A lot of what we did. The different advocacy roles I've had were to really summarize complex federal issues into a short paragraph for constituencies, right? For scientists, for members of a society who are interested in advocacy. And that was basically the job to be sort of boots on the ground to explain those concepts to the membership. And so you really learn how to synthesize a lot of information into short paragraph, which is important, and it's part of a lot of these roles. So try to write concisely and think big picture, right? So if you go to a legislator saying, I'll use my example with muscular dystrophy. So say fund muscular dystrophy research, you'd have to go to somebody that has supported science in the past, who may have a personal connection. So I give this example a lot when I was in with Society for Neuroscience. Obviously, that was specific to neuroscience research, but one of the members of Congress we went to his office, and he actually met with us. And his mom had Alzheimer's, just recently diagnosed before we had the meeting. And he said, I support neuroscience research funding because I have a personal connection and all of that. So you never know why, legislators interested in supporting your cause. I would say giving advice for folks that are going to Congress is to do your research on their background, what kind of bills they've supported before, what committees they sit on, can give you clues about what issues they care about. And if you're in their district, try to go to their district office and, chat with those people and learn more about what they're doing in their state, because those things are useful to get an idea of what they're interested in and if they may or may not support you. It's also obviously a very people-oriented field. So that was also, a learning curve for me, as, I'm sure many of you here think when you're a scientist and sort of you're used to working on your projects in the lab and you're constantly in meetings, especially I think this is going to be true even more so when I will be, in Congress, because you're meeting with constituents. So whichever side you're on, you're always meeting, trying to talk about your issues and either advocate for them or listen to constituents who come to you. That's something to get used to. And, it's a very interactive field. You're always talking to people. That's something that's definitely a skill to learn, is just having productive conversations. Sometimes with members of Congress or their staff, you get little time, 15 minutes sometimes, and you have to be able to quickly pitch what you're going for and summarize your research in very short time. So practice that. I think that answered the question.
Great, thank you. And on that note, if you could briefly expand on the resources or any kind of training, so the skill set that is available for the scientists to be able to do so?
Yeah, so I think scientists, you have your research expertise, which, as I said, the policymakers appreciate that. If you go to their office, again, if you're from their district, they like to hear from constituents because that's their job, is to listen to you and try to solve the problems that you have and serve the state. I think being able to persuasively talk about a topic, you're sort of doing that when you're writing grants, and you always think about this, and you're sort of like the broader impact section of a grant, right? That's kind of how I see this, is if you're already used to sort of selling why your research is important because you're asking for money, and so you can use that also when you advocate for something on the Hill. Again, keeping in mind that it should be targeted to what the member of Congress cares about and what they're likely to support. But in general, I think you have those skills already to sort of sell your research, so to speak. Just have to learn how to do it in a short time. I think a lot of these roles in policy, including consulting and all the other roles I've had, is a lot of project management, right? Those are things you've done and you were already well seasoned to do this and you're as a researcher. Many of the roles have also included mentoring and training students who are interested in either just policy generally or the legislative branch. So I've done that. So in that sense, again, being able to mentor students who are interested in your field comes in handy too, because you might end up doing that in a policy role as well.
All right, great, thank you. And on that note, I would like to also ask this question that now you've been a consultant and you're going to Congress. So how does it change? Like, do you have to do something extra, some additional responsibilities will you have going to the Congress and advocating for this? Or are they like two different things, or is it like interdependent on one another?
Yeah, so I think being an advocate and with the Hill and being on the Hill are sort of two sides of the same coin, right? So you're going to your lawmaker saying, I'm from your district, please support this issue. Or if they're interested in science, or sometimes there are things that are broader things that the higher education community or the research community is impacted by, that you can lobby for, and that's usually with coalitions or larger groups. I think what my impression is about Congress is that, obviously they're there to serve the country, serve the constituents, and they interact with many different groups that come with different demands. So I think it's more, it's interesting actually, because I think when you're in advocacy, it's more specific to say I'm advocating for research funding. For example, when I was at SFN, right, it was specific to neuroscience. We had a goal, to increase NIH's budget to a certain number to support this type of research. When you're in Congress, I think it's much broader. Your constituents come to you with different issues. It can be state or local, national, right? Things they're concerned about, and you're there to serve them. It can be different levels, can be different things that they're facing that you can help with. Again, whether it's if you're in a committee, you might be able to work on a bill related to that issue. I can give some examples to working for the University of California system, that a lot of the issues that we worked on were related to the state of California, right? So wildfires, valley fever, transportation, housing, and then of course higher ed issues that researchers in the UCs were facing and all of that. So that was quite broad in itself. But then I think, if you're on the other side of being on Capitol Hill, then you might get all of these constituents, right, that we talked about coming to you and saying, you might hear from the higher ed community, neuroscience community, right? All these things are sort of in one place, and you're discussing all these issues with these different groups coming to Congress.
Thank you. That's great. That's very helpful. And I have a couple of questions from the audience in here. I'd like to take one for you here. One of the attendees is asking, do policymakers also work with the government regulatory agencies closely, such as FDA or EPA?
Yeah, so I think it's similar to, I would say probably they would request expertise from some of those groups. So for example, if they're writing a bill on a new drug, trying to fund a new program, that's probably FDA would be helpful expertise. EPA for sure. Climate issues, I think, have become even more prevalent than they were before. There's a lot more working groups and discussions around those issues. So I think, again, EPA can be a good resource for Congress to say what's going on in your agency, what kind of programs do you have, and sometimes they have new programs that they ask, would ask Congress to write a bill on, or continue funding those programs too. So I think that's a good question, kind of from the other side of, again, there's likely a lot of different legislation related to health policy and climate policy that this expertise would be helpful for.
Great, thank you. I hope that answers the question. And now I have another question on the same kind of argument. Since you're doing both a combination of advocacy and research, how much scope of research do you have in your role? And if you can compare that to an academic setting at all, or that's not something that you can compare?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, well, in consulting, I will say that that depends a lot on the type of work you do, but I do policy research as part of this work, working with universities. I worked on some policy programs and developing training. So, I mean, the research there is what kind of programs already exist, so we don't recapitulate that. I worked with Federation of American Scientists to do one of their research projects for one of their programs and make recommendations. So you are doing research, but it's sort of abstract in a sense, right? You're interviewing people, trying to understand their experience and how to use that to make policy recommendations. Before that, and I can give one good example from when I was with the University of California, because obviously the advocacy there is based on research that is done obviously in the UC system, but my first project there was a briefing on AI, which that was obviously a hot topic at the time, it was just starting. And so we did an event to showcase AI research in the UC system for health stakeholders, agencies, any folks who are, again, working on bills or programs, depending on those issues. And so I had to do research on what was the latest in the AI field. Who should we invite on the panel, right? Who is an expert who can speak to this, and keeping that diverse. And so the research that we did is, and generally, I think doing research on what's already been done when you're putting together an advocacy event is important to be able to, get a grasp on the field and who's working on those things. And then again, invite the right people to talk to Congress about why that's important. The other side for doing research, again, I already mentioned this, but you really have to know your audience when you're going to the member of Congress and what they care about. So would definitely recommend doing research on that before you go to the Hill.
Thank you. And on that note, what are the opportunities for especially the early career scientists who would be willing to do a combination of work that you're doing, consulting, advocacy at the same time, are willing to go to the Congress? So what are the opportunities for them, and how would they be able to train themselves for these roles?
Yeah, well, opportunities, I think, I'll speak to the writing. So when I started out, was very vocal about issues I wanted, or things I wanted to see change in science and higher education, wrote blogs for early career. For example, eLife, I think, has one now, POS, ECR, that's one blog. Depending on the issues, there's specific ones too. So I wrote for the Association for Women in Science, their magazine, trying to lobby for more women in STEM. So again, the type of issues you're interested in, there may be places you can write about. Societies often have blogs. So if you're in a specific society, would inquire on that, because I think writing is a good way to start and kind of get your thoughts down on paper. Other things I've been involved with have been committees in scientific societies. Again, that's helpful if you can join a committee where you can organize policy events, did that with a number of groups. Was involved with the DC chapter of SFN. Again, chapters can be useful if you want to do local things for that society. I was also the CEO for the Journal of Science, Policy, and Governance. So put a plug here for this because it's a unique early career journal publishing policy papers from grad students, postdocs, policy fellows, people who are sort of in academia and closely, or maybe just graduated and are transitioning. It was started over about 12 years ago, maybe now. To provide a space for trainees to publish their ideas in policy. And there's other opportunities to get involved through the editorial board. So it's a good way to edit papers through there. And many folks have used this as a sort of stepping stone to go to the next level. I would encourage you, if you're interested in advocacy, also to look into Capitol Hill Days and short-term fellowships like the Marzion to get a feel for what it's like to be in DC if you're interested in federal opportunities. And then, keep an eye out for local things. Again, most of my work has been at the federal level, but there's things you can do in your state. If you look up ESEL, engineers, I forget what it stands for, but engineers and scientists acting locally. So they have a list of things you can do in your state, whether it's like city council, state governments, and other things that you can start doing locally.
All right, thank you. And on that note, GSA does have a policy and advocacy subcommittee. So if you're interested, check that out. And we do have a very good policy subcommittee that works in that space. So on that note, we do have another question from the audience, and this is more on the challenges that you might face on day-to-day basis, and how do you handle those challenges?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one of the things that's exciting about policy is that you can sort of move around a lot, but it doesn't always lend itself to maybe a stable position, or you're sort of like trying to figure out your place in the world in some ways, because you're starting out, especially if you spent many years in the lab, you're really starting out from the bottom in some ways, because you have to learn a whole new field and language and the ecosystem we talked about. It's a whole new world when you get into it. So being able to I think recognize that about yourself and say that I know I may be a really expert scientist in this area, but in policy I'm a novice, right? Starting out, and being able to be aware of that fact, and that you're placed in the system that more or less functions the way it does and has for many years. So you're going into something that's sort of regulated already. It's going to, I think in that sense, knowing kind of what you're able to do, what kind of impact you can make is helpful. And you learn that after a couple of years in a specific role. But also it is, as I said, it's exciting to be able to move around, and most people spend probably around 5 years in a role, I would say. You kind of learn everything from that amount of time. But then I think you have to think about how you want to be known in some ways. So, again, for me, having been an advocate, and I'm still an advocate for science, but from the other side, that if you want to be lobbyists, for example, and you're sort of pursuing that, is that something you want to do for the rest of your life, or do you want to move to something else, right? The freedom is there, but also it can be challenging if you're trying to establish a long-term career, to move around so many times. So I think at some point you have to establish and say, okay, I'm this, but that doesn't mean you can't change that, which is the good and bad of it, I think. It gives you a lot of opportunities, but then also you kind of want to figure out what you want to be in the long term.
I think that's true. So on that note, is there a metric for evaluating your progress? How is your progress evaluated? Do you set up some long-term goals or the short-term goals, like as researchers we do? How does that work for your space?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a interesting and difficult question to evaluate kind of what policy impact means. I think it depends where you are, and you have to take the small wins along the way. So a lot of times in advocacy specifically, one of the goals is to increase the NIH budget for X type of science, right? For example, that may or may not happen, depending on the administration. And this is where the realities come in of, who's in office, who's supporting this, how much can we achieve? If you're asking for a specific number, may or may not get to that point, right? So even if you get a little bump in the NIH budget increase from the previous 5 years, that's still a win. Sometimes I think just the realities of how things work, not everything happens. And again, it depends a lot on the environment. So I think progress can be evaluated by, did I achieve this goal, or is it even partially there, right? Is the NIH budget renewed? That can be a plus, even if it's not increased, right? That's one example. If you're talking about changing legislation and how far that goes, I can give this example, because when I was with the University of California, we were able to add postdocs in the CHIPS Act, which is a big accomplishment, to try to essentially educate the House Science Committee about why postdocs are an important part of the pipeline and why we need to include them. They had, of course, the whole bill is about American science and the research and the pipeline. So I think that was important. We're able to do that by virtue of the fact that, the university has a large influence in DC and connections that we had. That's one thing. The fact that it was sort of an opportune time that the committee was looking for input from the community, And even so, the bill took another year to go through Congress and become a law, right? And so that's a win in a sense of, postdocs were included. That was a win for me because I care about that. The fact that the bill became a law also is a win because very few, I don't know the exact percentage, but it's a small percentage of bills in Congress that actually make it that far in the process. So that's another win, right? So you can look at it a number of ways, and small wins along the way. Just a few examples.
I think that's a great answer and also a great segue to my next question, which is a postdoc really required for the careers transitions like yours?
I would say no. So a lot of the policy fellowships require you to have a PhD in hand, or by the time you start, you can apply for them when you're in your last year and then start the next year. The postdoc, I think, well, in my case, it was a good transition time because I was really started to explore my career transition out of academia during my postdoc. It gave me some stability because I think in grad school, I was very worried about graduating and publishing everything and had a timeline by the which to graduate. So there's certain pressures obviously that come with being in grad school. And then so when I had a postdoc, I said, okay, now I have a full-time job. I can sort of relax and be here and enjoy the science and then start exploring other things. And so I think for many it can be a useful time to transition or think about next steps if you don't know. If you're in grad school and you think you want to be in academia and you start a postdoc and then you realize, oh, I want something else, right? You have that backing and some cushion time to think about that and apply for fellowships if you don't get it the first time, right? And all of that. So it's not required, but it can help you in the process.
Of course, yeah, that's a great answer. And also joining societies might be a good way to explore that career option. So I wanted to explore or expand a little bit more on the progress question that I asked before. What would be some accomplishment in your career in policy that you are most proud of? And how did you achieve those accomplishments?
Yeah, so we talked about the legislation, I think. That's definitely one of the most exciting moments I guess backtracking a little bit, I had been interested in postdoc issues for many years, even when I was in my postdoc years already. Getting interested in sort of systemic issues in science, right? So published papers on, why we need to support the pipeline, why postdocs are important. Worked with a nonprofit to do research on postdoc salaries, and we pushed universities to increase salaries. So the advocacy was exciting from that point on. I think that's one point of pride early on starting out, because it was sort of bottom up, trainees trying to make change, and it worked to some extent. Surprisingly, universities did increase salaries. And so from our advocacy and research that we had done, papers that we published, and, going to universities to advocate for change, and they did increase salaries. That was a huge win for somebody who was early on and again, as a trainee and still not a policy professional. And so that's something that we encourage you guys to do and think about what you can do as a trainee to push for change. There's definitely opportunities for that, and you should try that. And then that evolved into many years to when I was in the UC system, I had somewhat of a position of power, although I was still pretty low in the chain, I would say, again, starting in policy, but having worked for organization that was influential in DC and with the House Science Committee that was looking for feedback and all of that we discussed, that was a huge win to be able to include postdocs in a bill that became a law. And again, fairly early on in my career, but also because it was significant because I had worked on postdoc issues for many years and had pushed for change and was actually able to do that. To see that bill become a law was a huge success.
Thank you. I think that's great. I also have another question from attendees. I know we discussed this briefly, but I would like to just reemphasize this in the interest of the audience here. The question is, do you have any suggestions for policy fellowships for the recent PhD graduates and or new postdocs?
Yeah, examples of, or what was the, suggestions, yeah. So it depends on your field. I would say definitely the AAAS Science Technology Policy Fellowships is sort of the gold standard. Placements are both in, actually, no, they have a judicial. So a lot of their placements are in the executive branch. I think the last few years they had around 250 or so. Congressional, they have generally around 30 or so, and then there's judicial, which is fewer, but they do have a couple if that's of interest. For a lot of these, you do have to have US citizenship. There are a few that you don't, so we can talk about that, or happy to chat offline if you're interested. A number of so one thing is through the AAAS program, there are a number of partner societies. So if you're a member of American Chemical Society, for example, that's a partner. So look into that because they can sponsor you through that society. It depends on your interest. I would say other mechanisms are depending on your topic. So for example, American Society for Human Genetics, that's pretty broad. Then there is things like Tech Congress, which is obviously it's a congressional fellowship, I think, for folks who have a technical background or they're interested in tech policy. Those folks have a lot of different types of backgrounds, but it's another rad and also a very interesting fellowship too. Other than that, more state fellowships have arisen in the last few years. I think there's about 10 or 15 right now, but more are being developed. So if you're in a state that may have one, I can't remember all the states off the top of my head, but New Jersey, North Carolina, obviously California was the first one, CCST. So also look into state fellowships if you want to stay where you are and get engaged. There may be something in your state to do that.
Thank you. I think that I hope that answers the question. And now that we've talked about the progress and accomplishment, the long-term goals and the short-term goals, I would like you to briefly expand on some of the recent examples of the science policy in action / what would be the hot topics in that space, if you could touch a little bit on that, so that if our attendees are interested in one of those, they could go and look more into that.
Yeah, so I guess, well, science policy in action, it's relevant to my recent work because, as I said, I've been working on different training programs through actually UC Irvine and also with the university's research association, developing a number of virtual programs. They're free. You can apply and we teach you all the skills about how to write policy and pitch your research. URA, actually, they're bringing 4 students to DC. It was the first year they had a program, but they're bringing students here to pitch to their legislators. So although a lot of these are virtual, but we try to do practical things, or through the Irvine program, we have a policy competition, also to where you would actually pitch to somebody that has experience. So these can be good ways to learn real the skills. And again, policy in action, I think, is helpful if you can do a Capitol Hill Day, get involved in your local government or state government, right? Those are ways to do that. And then in terms of hot topics, so again, it depends on your area of interest, right? So I think, so some of the things that I mentioned, the birth of the NSF DIP Directorate, right? So it's based on applied research, translational research. So there is a bit of discussion of how this landscape of research will look like when it comes to basic science, translational research, where the NSF money will go and how that will impact the basic research money, right? Are we moving towards more translational work? Will the basic research be impacted, right? How this is going to look like? It will be interesting to follow at NSF. increasingly, I would say in Congress, well, obviously there's a lot of discussion about US versus China. I think a few years ago, the House started a committee to talk about these issues, which is actively going, I believe. So if you're interested in sort of large questions, large scale issues about national questions around research and science, definitely follow. The House Science Committee is a good thing to follow. They have a newsletter about the bills that they pass and things they work on. So for me personally, because I'm more interested in science and research issues, these are the things I follow, right? If you're interested in climate specifically, there's probably a committee who's doing that, right? You can watch their hearings online and see what's going on based on your specific interest in terms of policy areas. Other things, I mean, there's so much going on, especially in the legislative branch, trying to find something that's specific to your interest. There's always something on that topic for sure.
All right. Yeah, thank you. So we know it's not all rosy. As researchers, we know our experiments fail more often than not. And we did talk about the challenges in the field as well. But I also would like to ask you, what would be the most difficult aspect of working in science policy, but at the same time, what is exciting to you about working in the science policy and advocacy?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, well, one challenge is, as I said, starting from the bottom and sort of learning the ropes, especially in DC, right? It's a complicated system. Also, trying to think about kind of your long-term goals and getting into that mindset of where do I want to be 5 years from now and planning long-term when you really have so much you can control, and that's one of the issues, right? If there's a new administration, that will impact what you work on and how you're responding to certain issues in the government. A specific organization that you work with and their views, right? So there's a lot of inputs coming at you, and sometimes you can't really plan your week, right? So I'm somebody that likes to, go in Monday morning, say, okay, I know what I'm going to do this week, and I have this laid out, and I used to do that in the lab. And so policy doesn't work that way. It's sort of like, oh, this happened in government, we have to respond. Our president, came up with this priority. That's the new priority, right? So for example, like when I was with the UC system, I mean, that's really my longest role so far. So it's a good example for a lot of these issues. One is that the university president changed while I was there. So we got new priorities, slightly different. The two had different backgrounds, and what we worked on changed slightly because we were in the office of the president. So, that can influence. When I started the role there, we were in the Trump administration, then we had the Biden administration. So that changed a lot of the responses to saying, we oppose President Trump for his anti-immigration policy or something like that, right? Trying to make science better, opposing things that were happening that we didn't agree with. Biden administration, in some ways, it's very much more pro-science, but also then there's other issues. He's very interested in diversity, right? Has clearly made that a priority to increase diversity in the administration and the placements that he has and people that he hired. And so diversity then became a big topic that, this is something we should get involved in to support the administration, right? So all those things are, I think the challenge is kind of responding to things and trying to create strategies of what is our organization's plan going to be in the next 5 years, knowing that you have to react to all the other factors, right? I think that's a big challenge. One thing that, but also to your question, I think that's also exciting because I like variety, and that's really given a lot of different types of experiences and kind of deliverables that came out of this too, like responding to, writing letters to Congress on different issues, right? Diversity, research funding, NIH, when COVID happened, again, no one could have predicted that, but it led to projects related to for example, how much money will it cost the university to go through COVID, right? How many people are losing materials and money and leaving the university or leaving science, right? That's a bigger question, right? How will US science be impacted? So COVID threw another curveball into that and created some really interesting and useful projects, I would say, from that that were unexpected. And I think I like again, from somebody who used to plan everything to the minute, coming into a role where you have little control over your day. That's a challenge, but also exciting because you're in the action, right? And hopefully Congress will be that way too, where this is happening, I have to respond. President Biden did this, it impacts the university, how do we respond, right? So I think that's also really exciting because you're impacting things in real time.
I think, yeah, that's very insightful. And thank you for that. So a lot of attendees actually had discussed about the policy fellowship databases and how to get into that. And we discussed that at length as well. But I would also like to have your advice for everyone here. How could the early career scientists be more competitive when they are applying for these science policy fellowships?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I think having a story and a area of passion in some way. So in some ways you have to know what you want and also be open-minded. And also you never know where opportunities are, so apply for things. I can give you an example. When I was applied to the fellowship at SFN, and a lot of these societies actually have specific requirements to where they would like to have or take folks who have backgrounds in those areas, right? So they actually said, we want to take a neuroscientist so we can continue growing the next generation of neuroscientists and policy and all of that. It makes sense because you're advocating for that research, so you have to know what it is and believe in it. But for me, because I had already advocated for postdoc salaries, the STEM pipeline, was sort of able to craft a story and say, I advocate for science, we published on salaries and all of the things that I had to show. So that's one lesson. Have something to show for the work you did, if it's a report or a blog or video or something. That was the story that, I'm interested in science. I'm an advocate for science. I can understand neuroscience, apply my research to this and do that. And that worked out. So I think in that sense was good to have a story to explain why I was interested in advocacy, why I think I could do it well, and all the questions that you might expect, right? But the story and the passion for the area kind of got beyond the hurdle of saying I don't have a PhD in neuroscience, but I have all the other things, and that worked. Now at this point, going for a congressional fellowship, I can say, this is probably the hardest interview I've ever had, to be honest, because it's sort of at this point in my career, I've already had a couple of jobs, right? And so that really fueled my interest to work on the Hill because both of my previous jobs were related to be working with the Hill, getting a little taste of, what this is. But never having been there. And I have a, pretty good, interest in public service and trying to help constituents and all of that. And you can sort of sell that. But again, the story that I had is really a personal story in some ways, right? That it's like, I have this interest, here are the things that I've done and how they got me to this point. And so in some ways there is a formula and you kind of know what to expect, what they're going to ask you. But I think it came down to, this person is really interested in this area and this is why, and how the experiences that you've had lead to this, how it's going to get you to the next stage and all of that. So I think prepare as much as you can by doing, getting experiences in policy, like we talked about, writing and going to the Hill and showing that you're interested. But also, craft your story and has to be something genuine that, this is why I want this because I really believe in this, because I have an example or a specific area and here are the things I have to show for it and have some idea about how it's going to help you. I think going into Congress, people say, be really open-minded because as we talked about, things can happen, right? And then you have to shift your project. I guess being used to that is a good skill. So I think, again, I'm in that boat of I have ideas of what I would want to do, but I'm also open to whatever happens. So that's a good strategy, and that'll get you farther, I think, than being really specific on an area that you want to work on.
I think that's true, and that's generally true for all the work that we do, even in the research as well. And I would also like to briefly expand on resources a little bit more. Where can people find more resources such as newsletters, where they can find more development on the federal policy if they would like to refer to?
Yeah, so I mentioned Journal of Science Policy and Governance. So look that up if you're interested in writing and editing. There are a few newsletters specifically at the federal level. So there's the FYI newsletter from the American Physical Society. They publish summaries of what's going on federally. I think it's a monthly newsletter. It's free. You can subscribe to that. And it's really well done and sort of explains what's going on. Again, if you're a GSA or other societies, if you're a member, they probably have newsletters about things that are interesting to their members, right? I would say also, having worked for a university, that's something that people forget, that there's the government relations office, and actually societies obviously have these as well, but where you can go and see, those people, their job is to link their researchers to federal opportunities or state opportunities. There are a lot of them have state offices too. So don't underestimate your university, because that can be helpful for getting you involved in some of these things, because that's, again, they're liaisons for that. But other than that, would again encourage you to look for resources on your specific area of interest, right? So if it's like climate or higher ed, there are specific groups that are working on those things, or coalitions. They likely can also provide opportunities or newsletters, things like that, about what's going on.
Thank you. I guess we covered most of the ground here, and I'm sure it was very helpful, very insightful for most of us that would like to venture into that space. So on behalf of the GSA's Career Dev Subcommittee, I thank Adriana and all of you for your time today and today's discussion. We look forward to your inputs and feedback after the workshop to help us organize these events in future, keeping your interest in mind. And thank you so much, Adriana, for your time today, for giving us all the insights about the policy and the consulting careers for the early career researchers. So I'm sure it was very helpful. And with that, I would like to thank you all and hope to see you again in our next event. Thank you all.